Dirty Moderates, America has always been a contentious place, a fractious, unique experiment in self-government. One of the things that you hear over and over and over again in the media, as if the country started 2 weeks ago, is that we've never been polarized. This has been horrible. We're riven. We're being torn apart at the seams. How could this be? And we all know, or those of us that follow history and are students of history know that is not true. And that's pretty unique to this unique experiment. And I'm really delighted to be interviewing H.W. Brands today, whose newest book is called Founding Partisans, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the Brawling Birth of American Politics. He is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written something like 30 books, lauded across the board, and I love his stuff, and I'm so glad to have you here. Bill, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you, Adam.
So I actually want to start at the beginning of it all, which is the beginning of your book, which I think is amazing because you outline the Jefferson Burr situation, the tie-in electoral vote. This is before the president, the vice president, obviously were elected on the same ticket. And you lay out the absolute deep panic, which you chart beautifully in the book, that each side had for one another. Oh my gosh, the Republicans, Democratic Republicans, anti-federalists, I think we can probably use them interchangeably, but I'll defer to you. We're taking power now, and there was all this panic about Hamilton and Adams and so on and so forth. And I bring this up to say, remind our audience, to the point of my introduction, of how this country has always been one long continuous debate with itself.
Yeah, well, to orient the listeners and the viewers, what you've described, yes, it's the opening of the book. It's actually a prologue, but it's not the opening of the story. It's very deep into the story. It's toward the end of the story. And I will betray an author's secret here. I never write the first pages until I've written the whole book, because I don't know how I want to start. I don't know what particular issues I want to bring to the front, what tone I want to set. So I started thinking about this book, researching this book, long before the election of 2020. And so I knew I wanted to tell the story of the emergence of political parties. You mentioned the conventional wisdom that often holds that parties are this relatively new appearance. I will say that there's a glimmer of truth to it in the following sense. And it was this glimmer that set me on the path to writing the book, because I had written about the Revolutionary War. And I had written about, I'd sort of glancingly toward this period. And I was aware that many of the founding fathers believed that they had created this republic. That's a matter of fact. But they believed that it would survive only if Americans could display civic virtue. That a republic couldn't work if all you relied on was self-interest. They had seen enough of self-interested politics in their observations of British politics. And that's exactly what they wanted to get away from. And so when they won the Revolutionary War, they thought, okay, we won. We're the good guys. The bad guys are now pushed away. And we can embark on this new experiment in self-government. And it's worth remembering, it was an experiment. Nothing like this had ever been tried, certainly on this scale, on a continental scale. And so they didn't know if it would work. They were used to political systems that relied on authority and coercion, where power came from the top down, not rising from the bottom up. And they didn't know. There were examples in history where things had gone wrong. Republics descended into empires and democracies dissolved into anarchy. And they hoped that this wouldn't happen to them. And they believed that it wouldn't, as long as the American people showed what they called the civic virtue. And what they meant was that people had to be willing in the public sphere to put the interests of the whole, of the community, of the state, of the nation, before individual self-interest. And if that was the case, then this might work. But if that was not the case, then there was every reason to think that it was going to slide into anarchy or into dictatorship. Well,
Right.
so now I knew that this is what they were saying to each other. And of course, I've been teaching and reading about American history for a long time. And I know that didn't happen for long. And so the question that I had is not so much, why did parties emerge? And I do tell that story, but what were they thinking when they thought that America would be spared political parties? So what's going on there? So anyway, so that conventional view that parties weren't with us from the beginning, there was that moment in the beginning where at least they thought we weren't going to get parties. But that moment only lasted, well, a year or two, really. So it quickly went away. So as to why I started the story the way I did, well, so we get through, so I really deal with the 1780s and the 1790s.
Yeah.
I explain.
Book is like 1780 to 1800 roughly, I'd say.
Yeah. And the first part of the book explains how two young men, and it's still surprising to me how young they were.
Yeah.
I teach at the University of Texas. I teach undergraduates and graduate students. And I tell my undergraduates even that the two guys behind this, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they weren't that much older than they are. Hamilton was in his early 20s when my story begins. Madison was in his late 20s. And they get it in mind to do nothing less, and this almost sounds like blasphemy against the founders, but they get it in mind that they're going to overthrow the government of the United States.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they do, because the government of the United States consisted of the Articles of Confederation, which they considered grossly deficient. And so they needed to be replaced by something else. So that's where my story begins, but it ends essentially with the election of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, to which you alluded. And the question there was, well, this is the first time in American history that the incumbent party loses. And then the question is, what happens when the incumbents lose? Do they deny that they lost? Do they resist leaving? Do they rise up and try to prevent the counting of votes or something like that? Or do they go in peace? And so I set the question up for my readers in the prologue, and I leave them hanging because they don't know at the end of the prologue what's going to happen. But John Adams, sometimes considered almost the saintly John Adams, he is considering the pleas of some members of his Federalist Party. We can stop this election. We can prevent this bad guy, Thomas Jefferson, from getting elected. Right. And as my story then really begins, Adams is still, what should I do? Now, I confess that that's the part of the story I decided to begin the book with after January 6th of 2021. Right. So, okay. And it does sort of connect present and past and vice versa.
If I may interject, yeah. I mean, I think the conventional wisdom which you refer to that I brought forth about, oh my God, we've never been this divided, and the parties seem, more than loggerheads. They seem like mortal enemies. They were talking like they were mortal enemies. Your book outlines that. People were your enemy. We couldn't let someone as awful, right, as a Republican or an anti-federalist take power. And, maybe we should have a coup. Maybe we can stop this, because now none of this is to make the analog to Trump and justify it, but it is to say that each side hated each other's side so much. And as you write about it too, the Constitution almost was not ratified. Yeah. I mean, almost, people forget that the anti-federalist sentiment was huge, and that essentially became the large R Republican sentiment, or Democratic Republican sentiment, Jeffersonian, which today I think has roots in, well, I guess you might say sort of small government populism, but everything's been scrambled. But
that's right. Things have really been scrambled. And I will just add
realignment. But the book does so much to show people, these guys weren't messing around. So the idea that it was all a group of founders and powdered wigs and lovely frocks, no.
And you're absolutely right in saying that the political rhetoric was much more heated than it is today. And so when Jefferson was running for president, first in 1796 when he lost to Adams, then in 1800 when he won, his opponents, the Federalists, they were saying, fathers, lock up your daughters because, these are horrible people.
Hyperbole. No, I mean, we're in an era now where we see everything coming
Jefferson was likened to the Antichrist.
Right.
And I will add that one of my 4 protagonists, Alexander Hamilton, winds up dead in a politically inspired duel.
Right. Yeah. The competing sides were not just, even though America, I do believe, has always been a competition of ideas. That's, cemented and ingrained in our DNA. But it wasn't just that, the Republicans and the Federalists disagree. They literally, and you write about it too, the man running against me, in this case, Jefferson, but in any case, they're unfit. These people were viewed as unfit. By the way, a word we hear bandied about rather indiscriminately about everybody we disagree with now. Joe Biden's unfit, Donald Trump's unfit. I'm not taking a position. I'm just saying that's what people say, right? Not fit for office. So it's important. Your book starts off you're right, in a cliffhanger, but really amazing wake. And then to dive into the title, Founding Partisans, and the brawl that goes with it. Now, let's go back to this. Tell everybody why you chose these guys. I mean, I think they're the right choice. The Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams. Interestingly, I hadn't thought about this till this morning. Maybe it means nothing, but there's no and. It's Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, commas. There's no, I don't know. Is that on purpose in the title?
It's Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the brawling birth of American politics. So, but the reason for the reason that I chose those 4 was I knew that I was going to frame the origin of the 2 parties. So I needed representatives of both parties, and I wanted to have even sides, 2 on each.
Right.
I also knew that because I was going to be telling the story of the writing of the Constitution and the overthrow of the Articles of Confederation, Madison and Hamilton had to be there because they were the driving force behind that. And then besides that, and then I knew that Adams and Jefferson were going to be the representatives of their parties who face off toward the end of my story, first in 1796, then in 1800. So they have to be there. But in addition, I wanted individuals who could tell their story in their own words. To the extent that I can when I write, I try to put my characters, my historical figures, front and center.
Yeah.
This because the part of history that always attracted me, that drew me to history in the first place, was reading the words of the people who are actually there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes these would be old letters. Sometimes they would be journals of explorers. They would be diaries of people who were in the war. Because I've always, like our courts of law, I always trust eyewitness testimony more than the hearsay of people who weren't there. I mean, we historians, we are hearsay witnesses because we are saying what other people said. And one of the great things about writing about this generation is that they were all very literate and very articulate. And so they're making these arguments. They're making arguments about what kind of government should we have? Should we have one that is centralized, one that is decentralized, where power rests with the states? And I wanted readers to hear their arguments. And these guys, these 4, are very good at conveying those arguments. They were, a couple of them were trained as lawyers. They all became sort of pamphleteers or speakers. Mm-hmm. And there was one last thing, and this is just sort of an authorial preference, if you can make it work. And that is that I wanted their voices to be distinctive enough, one from the other, so that if a reader just happened to open the book to a certain page, having read some of it and gotten used to their voices, then I wouldn't have to be saying, Jefferson said, Hamilton said. They would simply recognize the voice. And in this, I was reminded of when Berry Gordy, who was the founder of Motown, the Detroit 60s music,
sure,
when he replaced one of the original members of the Supremes with Diana Ross. He did so knowing that Diana Ross's voice was not in an operatic sense as good as the voice of the woman that she replaced, but it was more recognizable. And Gordy's thinking was, the people that I want to buy the records, they're going to be driving down the road in their car, and their car radio is going to be on, and they're going to be punching the buttons the way you used to go from one station to another. And they would hear 3 syllables out of the mouth of Diana Ross and say, I know who that is. And so I wanted people whose voices were recognizable. And John Adams is great. John Adams, and I will tell you, from the standpoint of the historian, John Adams is particularly great because he's married to Abigail Adams, and they spent much of their married life apart. And when they were apart, of course, they were writing letters to each other. So the letters that Hamilton writes are mostly letters to his professional peers. And likewise, mostly for Jefferson and Madison, although Jefferson and Madison are friends, so they sort of bare their souls a little bit. But John Adams is constantly bearing his soul to Abigail. And he's explaining, history will not remember me sufficiently and all this stuff. So Adams really comes alive because of the letters that he's writing to Abigail.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out too, because I know you've written a lot of biographies, and I love historical biographies, is when you read a biography, and when one reads biography, there's like a concentrated subjectivity to it, right? You know what I mean? You're getting the events swirling around the person and the story basically through their eyes. That's the point of a biography. Right. So what I love is that you chose these 4 men to tell the story because you've given them distinctive voices, and you've given people a portal into understanding partisanship, its origins, the nature of it, and kind of the ongoing fight we have. What I'd love to ask you to talk to the readers about, because I think people are very confused about parties. People are not into history. People don't do what I do, certainly don't do what you do, and I mean, I was telling someone the other day, we really haven't had an official new party in this country since 1854, really, since the Republican Party, right? Basically, the Whigs were gone and all of that. Who are the Federalists and who are the Republicans? Let's try to explain that, because I think I love this because I'm drenched in this stuff. But I think if one reads this, they're confused on what a Republican is, which sounds like they don't know what it is. And I think there's virtue, no pun intended, in analyzing.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing to keep in mind is that until the second Republican Party came along, the Republican Party of Lincoln, Jefferson's party was the Republican Party.
Right.
And in his day, people didn't call it the Democratic Republican Party. No. That's something that's been imported from, in the future, back then to distinguish it from that other Republican Party. So in my book, I simply use the term Republican. Fine. And within that context, so we'll call them Republicans, but that wasn't their original name. So I said earlier that these people, these men, believed, they hoped, that the American Republic would be spared political parties. They'd seen those in Britain and they didn't want to see them in America. However, the first thing that they did, the first part of my story is they write this new Constitution. Mm-hmm. And after they write the Constitution, the question is, will it be ratified or not? And this is when the first parties formed. They didn't call them parties. They didn't even call them factions. They just considered them coalitions in favor of the Constitution or against the Constitution. Now, those in favor of the Constitution, they got out of the gate first, and they branded themselves very successfully as the Federalists because they're in favor of this new federal government. The opponents, they were slow off the mark, and they just sort of allowed themselves to be called the Anti-Federalists. And if you define yourself negatively, you're always half a step behind. But the binary nature of the parties, the polarity, for and against, this foreshadows everything that follows in American politics. And there's a very good reason for this. In the first place, this question they were debating was a yes or no question. It wasn't a multiple choice. So you're not going to get 3 or 4 or 5 parties. You're going to get all those people who, for whatever reason, think that this new government is preferable to the old government, and they'll line up under the Federalist label. And you'll get all those people who disagree with that, who for whatever reason say, I don't want the new Constitution. I like the old one, or I'm afraid of the new one, whatever it might be. They're on the other side. Right. Now, if you stop and think about it for a minute, politics almost always reduces to this yes or no question. Yeah. It's true when we have a referendum, like on the Constitution. Every time a bill goes for a vote in Congress, it's ultimately yes or no. Do we amend it? Yes or no. Right. And the way we hold our political elections, historically, you always have this candidate or that candidate. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been those exceptions where there are 3, 4 candidates, but those have been unusual. And so the reason for this is, as I say, that when decisions come down to a yes or no, then in a competitive political system, all those people who, for whatever reason, are in favor, they get on one side. And all those people who, for whatever reason, on the other side, they get on the other. And one might think that, well, okay, on this issue, the yeses would consist of these people. And then on the next issue, a different issue, the yeses would consist of a different group of people. And that is sometimes true. However, the nature of the very first vote, the one that gave rise to the two parties, is a fundamental philosophical question. If you like bigger government, stronger government, more centralized government, you are a federalist. And that's what it comes down to. If you are opposed to that, if you are suspicious of government, if you think that, well, if government there must be, it should be of the states and not at the center. If you distrust the grasping nature of politics, you're going to be on the other side. So what the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were arguing about was essentially what we in America have been arguing about ever since. So it gets confused as other issues come in. And we speak at a time when, Donald Trump has been the guiding star of the Republican Party now for 7 years. And Trump doesn't fit easily into that bigger government or smaller government mode. But it's worth noting that at the very beginning, it was the Jeffersonians who gave rise to the Democratic Party after some renaming. Yeah. They were the ones who wanted smaller government. Mm-hmm. And it was the Hamiltonians, the ones who eventually would be favored by modern conservatives, who wanted bigger government. But still, there was this basic split. And again, if you think about it, very often, this is what political questions come down to. Yeah. Do you trust government or you distrust government? And so it's not too surprising that we only have these two parties. I would just add then, the mechanics of parties in America. Yeah. They really reinforce this duality, because if the two parties at any given time can agree on anything, it's that there should not be third and fourth and fifth parties. Now, it's worth noting that in a lot of other systems, democratic systems, Republican systems, there are multiple parties. In Britain, there are often 3 parties. In Germany, there are 3 or 4. In Israel, there are half a dozen or more parties. But in order to allow small parties to thrive, you really have to jigger the system. You have to make the rule, you have to bend the rules, because, for example, in a typical proportional representation system, if your party gets 15% of the vote, you get 15% of the seats, regardless of whether any single one of your candidates won a majority. We don't do that. And so that's why we've always had just 2 parties. They've had various names. So the first 2-party system was the Federalists and the Republicans. Mm-hmm. The Federalists faded away within 30 years, and they eventually were replaced by the Whigs. And by the time the Whigs came along, the Republicans had been renamed the Democrats. So by the early 1830s, we've got the Democrats against the Whigs. The Whigs self-destruct in the 1850s, and they're replaced by the Republicans, the modern Republicans. And from that time, from the 1850s until now, we've had the same 2 parties with the same 2 labels. However, because we only get 2 parties, those parties themselves have been coalitions. Mm-hmm. So for a very long time, There were conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats. There were conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. That part has changed in the last 50 years or so. And so it is true that partisanship today, and really from the 1980s or 90s until now, is different than partisanship before. The two parties today are more clearly separated by their ideology, by their thinking, than parties were before. In earlier times, parties were often as much about what part of the country you lived in, and just the nature of state politics.
Yeah, I mean, you had that. I think the collapse of the regional flavor of coalitions within each party, actually think has been really bad, because I think there were times that, there are many times in our modern history, right? I mean, there'd be no, even though LBJ was a Democrat, there would be no Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act without a Republican Congress.
Right.
Because the, segregationist faction, the old South, did not want that. And
that's right.
That was an example where you needed, you look up the votes, young Bob Dole, young Gerald Ford in the House of Representatives voting for civil rights, representing almost all white districts, but they were the party of Lincoln. Right. And that was an idea whose time has come, as Everett McKinley Dirksen famously said in backing the bill, the Center for Unity. So we don't have that anymore. And that's, I think, to our detriment. But to the point of your book, what in the debate that went on once in the beginning of, let's just say, after the convention, after the Constitution is ratified, you have George Washington, right, who we know is our first president, former general of the Revolutionary War. And I bring him up because he's not in the title, but there he is hovering 30,000 feet, right, in this period which book takes place, that last decade of the 18th century, really. Talk about the relationship of George Washington, right, as president, who really, as you write about, didn't really care about party, didn't believe in them, didn't really want them, but he kind of got pulled into sort of a quasi-federalist role, would you say, by virtue of his presidency, or speak to that?
Yeah, so what I would say is that George Washington was the last nonpartisan president we've had. He was our first president and the last nonpartisan president. Right. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that Washington was a firm believer that the national welfare required a national civic virtue. Right. And so he thought that parties were a really bad thing. So there's that. Right. Secondly, George Washington had a reputation that was more than head and shoulders above everybody else, especially after Benjamin Franklin died. Okay. Oh, right. So Washington did not have to play politics. And related to this is the fact that Washington was essentially beyond ambition at this point. Yeah. So he accepted the presidency somewhat reluctantly as basically a trophy for having led the country to victory in the Revolutionary War. So his presidency was his victory lap. And so he did not have to think ahead and say, okay, who am I going to get to support me when I try to do this, that, or the other thing? So Washington can indeed stand above the fray. But everybody else is young enough that they're trying to figure out what's next. So 2 or 3 of them are really thinking, well, I want to be president one day. And so who am I going to get to back me for president? And it became very clear by the time Washington left office that you had to have a party behind you, because that's the way things were being organized. And it's just sort of, well, I mean, a lot of it had to do with the fact that at the time of the writing of the Constitution, nobody knew exactly how this new government was going to work. No. So they didn't know, the biggest thing is they didn't know how candidates would be recruited and how the numbers would be filtered out and how we'd finally get to somebody. And one of the reasons they didn't think this through further was they spent so much time debating the nature of Congress, because Congress, in their thinking, was this is going to be the driving force of the new government. And remember, they're thinking of a government, well, the government they last had was the government of Britain. And by the 1770s, the monarch in Britain was kind of diplomat in chief, but the monarch was not independent really of Parliament. Parliament ran the show. And the Americans, Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, pointed the finger of blame at George Washington, but he knew that wasn't correct. It's just, it's a lot easier to vilify one person than to vilify a whole body of people. So we could make a bad guy out of George III. But so they spend all this time on Congress, and they get to the end of the summer. This is 1787, hot summer in Philadelphia, and they're running out of time, and they really haven't thought that much about the executive branch. They decided the executive is going to be independent of Congress. So it's not going to be like the Prime Minister of Britain, who is a member of Parliament and chosen by the majority party. No. This person is going to be elected separately. But they said, in defense of their sort of laxity in describing the executive branch, they all just sort of looked over to George Washington, who was president of the convention. I have to add here that one of the secrets of Washington's success was his mastery of silence. So Washington knew that if he got sort of down and dirty in debates at the Constitutional Convention with these other guys, he wouldn't come off looking very well. He wasn't a trained lawyer. He wasn't a controversialist. So he accepted the presidency of the convention. So he presided over the convention, and he interpreted his role as meaning that he couldn't speak in the debates. He would just sit there and say, okay, your turn. But he wouldn't engage in the debates himself. Sort of like the Speaker of the House of Commons, who just wields the gavel but doesn't actually enter the debate. So people would look over at George Washington and say, he's the one, he's going to be the first president. Let George figure it out. And so that's why the Article 2 of the Constitution was the most poorly written part of the Constitution. And large parts of it had to be torn up and rewritten fairly quickly because nobody knew how the Electoral College was going to operate. They certainly did not anticipate there would be these parties and tickets where they would be a president and a vice president. And that's kind of the origin of the controversy surrounding the 1800 election, where the two Republicans, Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his running mate, they tie. It wasn't intended that they should tie. Oh, and I have to add. So here's one when I explain this to my students, they scratch on their heads. Come on, what were they thinking? So originally, the president, of course, was the one who got the most electoral votes if he got a majority. And then the vice president was the runner-up. Well, I mean, the runner-up, that's fine, maybe, if you're voting for student body president or something. But if you're voting for the president of the country and the country has divided into parties, what's happening is that the president is the leader of one party and the vice president, the president in waiting, is the leader of the other party. And that's no way to run an administration. I mean, you can bet, and this is certainly true, that when John Adams was president and Thomas Jefferson, his principal rival, was vice president, Adams didn't include Jefferson in any of the conversations of the administration. He was just left out of everything.
Yeah, I mean, just as a side note, up until really the modern vice presidency, you could argue Walter Mondale might be the first one. Some people think it might be, some people think it was more Dick Cheney. But if you start with Mondale, people in their for parties now are elected together, people on that ticket, and many, many presidents do not include their vice presidents in their discussions now. And they're in the same party. It's the famous John Nance Garner, the vice presidency isn't worth a bucket of spit, or Roosevelt. So it's interesting how the study of almost human nature kind of dictated that they need to find a way to make sure that these parties stick together, because if you've got mortal enemies, as they saw each other, in one administration, forget it, I wanted to, though, talk about Europe and America for a second, because you it's such an important part of the book. So a lot of things, when people talk about the Revolutionary War and the role of the king, a lot of people don't realize that there was a glorious revolution, or not aware of that, in 1688. So you're going back like 80 years before, which really established Parliament as the primary seat of power. It restricted the king's power, if you will. Okay, so even though the colonists are rebelling against the House of Hanover and King George III, they're responding to these oppressive acts of Parliament, the Stamp Act and all that stuff that are part of this discussion. France, right, because they're at war with Britain on and off, or had been certainly in the 7 Years' War leading up to coinciding with this history, they're a big ally of ours. And so when it comes time that we establish our form of government and the old ancien regime is falling apart, though they had been our allies, right? We have a schism in our politics that you write about in the monarchist versus Jacobin section, which is wonderful. I always love the word Jacobin. I don't know why.
Right.
But, you know, Jacobites. We have a lot of Jacobites in this country now. I think we're trying to bring it down, but that's a separate discussion. You've got this thing where the Republicans, to use a word in the classical sense of the Jeffersonian, certainly Jefferson, really believe that France has a right to be bloody, really, because they've had this frustration about a central government in America, I think, you know, as you write about too. It's kind of taking away their rights, the will of the people being thwarted. If people are angry, they should rise up. You know, this makes, you know, Hamilton and the Federalists aghast, you know, and America doesn't lend military support, even though they had been our allies. Also, the Federalists don't want to pay back the debt, right? Which we had incurred on behalf of France. So it's great. I want to talk about that whole section because you devote a lot of time to that book. And I think the overlap, people always say, oh, there was the American Revolution and there was the French Revolution. These are two very different kinds of revolutions. And the American Revolution, we removed ourselves from the yoke of royalty, of royal power. The French beheaded their monarchs. Those two very different kind of things. So,
yeah. Well, so in fact,
there's a lot in there, but I love it.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I was kind of puzzling at the beginning over what were these people thinking that there weren't going to be political parties. Of course, there are going to be political parties. Ambitious people have different ideas and they'll put their ideas forward strongly. But there was a slim basis for thinking that might be the case. And one of the things that did distinguish the American Revolution from the French Revolution, and that is, in the French Revolution, the losers had no place to go. They were stuck. And the losers received what the losers often get in revolutions. In this case, they got the guillotine.
Yeah.
In the American Revolution, the losers had an exit strategy. So I wrote an earlier book called Our First Civil War. And it was about the split among Americans during the American Revolution.
Right.
So there were the Whigs, or the Patriots as they called themselves, and the Loyalists,
right,
the Tories. The Loyalists were the ones who said, no, we ought to stay attached to Britain. And the Patriots are the ones who said, we want independence. So at the end of the American Revolutionary War, and those two words in American history, they come together, revolution and war. And they're not always the same thing, but our first war is a revolutionary war. And it almost certainly would have been bloodier had the Loyalists not had an exit strategy. In fact, when the British troops sailed away, 100,000 Loyalists sailed away with them, and they just leave the scene. And this is why, that's first of all why there isn't the bloodbath after the victory of the Patriot side, and also why, for a moment, the winners, the Patriots, thought, well, we won't have parties because that other party just left. There's only us good guys who all agree that are here. Okay, so that's part of the reason. But the other thing is, there was a difference of opinion, even on the winning side of the American Revolution, of how revolutionary this thing was. Was it primarily simply a struggle for home rule? So basically, get rid of the royal governors, get rid of the authority of Parliament, get rid of King George, and we'll govern ourselves. Right. Is that it? And if that's the case, then the ruling class in colonial Virginia becomes the ruling class in the state of Virginia. And the ruling class in the colony of Massachusetts becomes the ruling class in the state of Massachusetts. If that's what's involved, then okay, that's what happens. And somebody like Alexander Hamilton believed, yeah, that's what this should be. Right. But there were other people who said, no, this really should be a revolution where we're going to overturn the system and not simply get rid of the top level, but we're going to overturn things. And ordinary people will actually govern. And so when the French Revolution breaks out, and you very adeptly described reactions to the French Revolution. So it's people like Jefferson, who, although a patrician himself, is all in favor of democracy. And so he's naturally drawn to the French Revolution because he thinks that the people ought to rule. Whereas Hamilton never thought the people ought to rule. And so he's appalled by it. And there's something else about this as well. And this is what really gives bite and acrimony to the partisan debates in America. Yeah. Because if you're simply discussing intramural affairs, if you're simply discussing domestic affairs,
right,
that can only get so heated, because what should the tax rate be? And how are we going to regulate trade between the states? But when you inject a foreign element, if you say my opponents in that other party are not simply wrong, but they are potentially disloyal and treasonous, they're selling out America to the wrong foreign country. And the people on the other side are saying the same thing, but they're saying it's the other party. So when you inject this foreign element, then you can talk about your political opponents, not just as your opponents, but as enemies of the state. Right. And once people start using that kind of phrasing, enemies of the state, because that justifies nearly anything. I'm protecting the country by opposing those bad people. I'll add one last thing on this subject. Sure. It was certainly true in the 1790s. It's true today, and it's been true through most of American history, but not all of American history, that the people on one side, when they talk about partisanship, they're always using it as a criticism or an insult against the other side. It's only the other side that engages in partisan behavior. On our side, we're just doing the right thing. There was no conception at this point that a healthy republic requires two robust parties.
Yes.
That a ruling party requires an opposition party to keep its head on straight, to keep it in line. There have been a few moments in American history where people have said, yeah, the Democrats will say we need a strong Republican Party, and Republicans will say we need a strong Democratic Party. Those moments have been rare. It's almost always the case. We would love for that other party to go away. If we can simply destroy them, the better for us, the better for the country. And if you're going to embrace party politics as this is the way politics takes place, you really do have to acknowledge the legitimacy of the opposite party. But there are all sorts of aspects of emotionalism, of partisan gamesmanship that prevent people from making that acknowledgement.
Yeah, well, I stand as somebody, not a member of either party, who knows how much we need two healthy parties in this country. I think we're seeing that, and in the contemporary political debates, you will often hear many liberals, contemporary liberals, not classical liberals, or today's Democrats. Oh gosh, the threat of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and they must be burned down and reformed. And I'm almost 50 now. I remember when you said John McCain and Mitt Romney were the devil too, and they needed to go away. So some of that rings hollow. I mean, it makes your point that they've always not really wanted. They've wanted their side to always be in power and would rather the other side not be there. But there's a lack of legitimacy in that, because this leads me to my next question. Don't you also think that the revolutionary fervor that America used to become its own self-government, was so rooted in the debate over independence? In other words, there's two things going on here. All of the thoughts that led to the idea that America could break away, right, gave, despite all the fighting and sense of disunity, a kind of intellectual firmament for people who were highly educated, who went to the public houses, who wrote pamphlets and did that stuff, so that when the Articles of Confederation didn't work, people, New York didn't want to pay, or Virginia didn't want to pay for the boots of its soldiers in New York. There's always been these debates about the size of government. But interestingly, unlike, let's say, what went on in France, where it was, we're going to overthrow the monarchy, to hell with the church, everyone's going to the guillotine. Robespierre went to the guillotine. Whereas in America, even though independence and constitutionality were two different things, there was a movement through a set of competing ideas all the time that I think gave it, I don't know, maybe some baseline of democratic security.
So one of the things that really distinguishes the American Revolution from the French Revolution is France was a unitary state. Right. And in America, there were 13 different states. Right. In France, there was an established church. In America, there wasn't. And so the revolution had almost nothing to do with religious positions. And there were 13 different arenas of politics during the American Revolution. But there's something else that goes on here that kind of confuses this. And that is two terms are used during the American Revolutionary War. And one is independence, and the other is liberty. And they're often conflated, okay? Because liberty could be liberty from Britain. But liberty can also mean, as an individual, I want to be free of government shackles or old authority or something like that. So liberty is potentially a more revolutionary term. Revolutionary in terms of revising the social contract within the country. Independence is really just this matter of we're going to break the ties to this foreign country. So every American can say we ought to be free of Britain and be considered, I'm a patriotic American. Yeah. But once you get beyond that, then should individual Americans be free of their own government? You know, how much political power should individual Americans have? Should they defer to their betters, to the people like George Washington? Mm-hmm. And I mentioned Washington was sort of the last nonpartisan president. He was the last one who could expect deference from voters and from everybody else. Nobody stood up to compete against George Washington. But once he's gone, then game on for everybody else. And so, you know, he's sort of the last of that Augustan model of president, where you almost think that George Washington was born on a pedestal. And I should just add that it's often thought that George Washington did the country a great service by retiring after 2 terms, because the Constitution didn't say he must. And if he had agreed to serve a 3rd term, then the American presidency, indeed American politics, might have been very different, because it turned out that he died before that 3rd term, what would have been his 3rd term, ended. He died in 1799. And if he had still been in office when he died, rather than setting the precedent of self-abnegation, okay, I step aside, no, the precedent would have been president for life. And then the American presidency would have been like the papacy. You get elected and then you serve till you die. And so or like a position on the Supreme Court. So if that had happened, the stakes of presidential elections would have been much greater. Now we know you get 4 years, and maybe you get a 2nd term after that, but that's it. And so, but the reason Washington stepped down after 2 terms was not that he said, oh, it's time to do this last good thing for the American people. No, he was so fed up with party politics and the fact that he, George Washington, for heaven's sakes, was being criticized by the Republican press. He said, I don't have to take this stuff. I'm out of here. So party politics drove Washington from office. But in the process, it caused Washington to do this really good thing for the American presidency, for the American people, to set this precedent that lasted a century and a half.
The other thing to talk about, which is very important in your book, which I think also is completely tied into our contemporary ignorance about partisanship as it relates to news, is you talk about all the roles of the partisanship through newspapers, going on. And I say this to say that, yes, it was obviously an agrarian society. It was a different time. It wasn't a digital age. I mean, it wasn't an electronic age. So when people talk about the cable news or the spread of disinformation, granted, it's become much more unwieldy, but whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or ever, ideological battles, slings and arrows, mud, venom, all of that came from newspapers. And that's how they did. And they were there, it's like the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I mean, there's names for papers for a reason. They're not named, arbitrarily. Talk about the partisanship through the time and world of news when the founders were.
So in the first place, if you were going to establish a political system where people actually exercise power, people vote, the people need to be informed. So the need for news, political news that people could use, was much greater after the Revolution, after the American colonies were governing themselves, not being governed from Parliament. In the colonial days, whether people were up on the latest political debates or not was not a big deal because they couldn't really influence the outcome of those debates very much. But now all of a sudden they need to be. And so there is all of a sudden a market for news and newspapers. And as the parties develop, the parties decide, well, we're going to get our story out. So each political party organizes, raises money to create its own papers. And so for those of us who remember the days when Americans got our news from one of the 3 big network broadcast news shows, 6 p.m. in the evening, and that was an age also when a newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, whatever it might be, big newspapers considered it important to reach broad audiences.
Yeah.
And that was just the nature of the business model of the media in those days. And the idea then, okay, that at least the goal is objectivity in news.
Right.
And in television, this was codified in the fairness doctrine. If you had a spokesman for the Republicans, you had to have a spokesman for the Democrats.
Right.
So they played them down the middle. Then came cable TV. And instead of having 3 television news, you could have 500. And so the fairness doctrine went away when cable news started it. And Americans like me who grew up in that age when, Walter Cronkite wasn't obviously a Republican or obviously a Democrat, and he didn't editorialize. He said, that's the way it is, whatever the day was. But then come the 1990s and ever since, and then social media, they doubled down on this, where you listen to the news that you like. This is simply a reversion to form. So today you pick your news outlet according to your political philosophy and your partisan affiliation. That's what you did starting in the 1790s, and indeed for most of American history up to the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean it's now, because we're so well past the idea of even just cable news, where people are getting not even news, but just information or lack of that I think also has, for lack of a better word, tribalized us, even more so than cable news, because I think that I'm actually more curious about this. You watch how political issues kind of like calcify on each side, and how sometimes they come from something outside of mainstream news, and they become part of the debate, right? It could be vaccines, it could be Putin, it could, what I mean? And then they get adopted almost in the kind of Jeffersonian sense that enough people start rallying behind it, and it kind of, lack of a better word, infects parties.
Yeah, well, so the way I
that's interesting, and not always for the better, but not always for the worse. It's
right.
It's
so the analogy, being a historian, I tend to look for historical analogies, and here I think of the pubs and the coffee houses of the old times, where you would choose your pub or you choose your coffee house depending on the people who were there and the people you liked and the people who probably held rather similar views to you. Yeah. And social media are like that. You can get Facebook groups, you can get groups on other social media, you can follow the people you like. And so it's a self-reinforcing cycle. And if enough people get talking about it, then they can raise this issue in a way that political officials feel obliged to deal with. So you can think of it as kind of this infinite coffee house, and where everybody has a megaphone, and if they talk loudly enough, it comes up. But again, it's the kind of self-segregating according to your political views that is actually perfectly common in life. So when people go to a sports bar, they go to a bar where they can watch their favorite team along with fans of that team. Right. You don't go to the enemy sports bar. People like
you do if you want to go cause trouble, right? You go there to.
Well, okay, yeah. If you want to do that, if you want to get in a fight, right. But people, naturally are drawn to people who agree with them because it makes them feel smart.
That's right. Yeah. So as we're drawing toward the end here, I want to try to make, because again, the work of a historian, the analogies that can be drawn. I mean, to the point of information, it's being drilled into, or at least by the mainstream media, that democracy is in great peril, and Trump would represent a threat to that. I do believe that. I mean, I do believe Trump's a threat. I'm not a Trumper at all. But when you think of history, you think of what you've written about in your book, And, I don't know, should we have a coup? This Adams fellow or this Jefferson fellow, he's a bad dude. Again, do you think using, and this is more speculative, I know, but drawing on your historical knowledge and work in academia and your work as a widely published person, do you think there's hyperbole surrounding the description of where our country's at right now?
So I try to imagine if I were writing the history of, let's say, the 2024 election in 2034, after I know how it turned out.
Okay.
I could sit down right now and I could write 2 drafts of that. And one draft would be where the election is held in an orderly manner and somebody wins and the other side gives a gracious concession speech and the country moves on. Okay? And I would say that there's a lot of historical precedent for that, because every losing president before Donald Trump gave a concession speech and, okay, the appropriate response is not to litigate, not to contest the election, but to go prepare for the next one, okay? So we might look upon 2020 as this one-off, this anomaly.
Right.
And then things revert to form. But another possibility is, and so there's historical precedent for that. There's 200 years of American history sort of pointing to that outcome and that explanation. On the other hand, before the American Republic, there has been no system of government that lasted forever.
Right.
And so Rome had a republic for hundreds of years, and there's absolutely no historical reason to think that American democracy, the American Republic, will last forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, given the still contested nature of the 2020 election, it's not impossible that, let's say Donald Trump gets elected, and then one might think, okay, well, that's it. That's his second term. He doesn't get a third term. But, he could say, let's suspend the 2028 election, or we'll make changes. Abraham Lincoln was tempted to suspend the 1864 election because the country was at war. The public interest was imperiled. And so presidents, it's happened in other countries. Is it impossible it will happen here? I don't know. And so the answer is, I don't know where this is going. I will say one other thing, and that's one of the things that differentiated the outcome of the 1800 election, which I left my readers hanging at the beginning and recently. In that early period, the people who were contesting the elections were the ones who had created the government.
Yeah.
And they knew how fragile the system was.
Very good point.
And they didn't want the 1787 Constitution to go the way of the Articles of Confederation. This one has to work. Yeah. And so they had this interest. It was essentially a proprietary interest in making this experiment work. Yeah. They knew if we screw it up now, we might not get a third chance. And so John Adams, who could have screwed up the election of 1800, didn't. He said, nope, we're going to abide by the wishes of the people. There is a tendency, however, when institutions have been in place a long time, to think that, well, it was inevitable that they would happen this way. And furthermore, America has always been a democracy. It always will be a democracy. So we take things for granted and assume that they will always be so. And we don't tend them. We don't tend to them the way the founders did. And so it's tempting for people to say, okay, Donald Trump has not abided by the rules, but, the Republican Party will go on, the country will go on. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't.
Right.
And so there has to, at some point, I talked early on about civic virtue. At some point, somebody has to say, a lot of people have to say, this is bigger than me, this is bigger than my party, this is bigger than this election. Yep. The most important thing is that this system that we have keep going.
Yes.
And don't think just about the outcome of this election. Think about the fact that we have to have another election and another election and another election. Don't think about the next 4 years. Think about the next 100 years.
Yeah. I love the term civic virtue because, to use myself as an example, I consider myself part of a Hold My Nose coalition. Okay. So I'm meaning that I perceive Trump as a very mortal threat to a lot of what we're talking about, to the work certainly you've analyzed, and more so to your point, it's not a young country. It's not Adams and Jefferson, as awful as it was, this feels, and we only know what we lived through, right? Of where we've been in our lifetime. This feels very different. But I also am deeply discouraged by the direction of the country and the Biden administration. I have a lot I like about him, I have a lot I don't like about him. And I'm worried. However, to your point and to the point of the book, this is larger than me, right? And I'm a never Trumper because of that. I have philosophical differences on the economy, on defense, military, a whole bunch of things that Biden has done. But I will vote for him in November the way I did the last time because it's Trump. I think that message, the meaning of the republic and the virtue that comes with it or attends it is something that can't be emphasized enough.
Yeah,
but I'm an educated person, and I'm addicted to politics, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I have a graduate degree. I'm not somebody who's just angry, rightfully so, that eggs are up 18% or thinks we shouldn't give foreign aid to Ukraine. I mean, things I might not agree with, but I love the idea of civic virtue is my point. And one hopes we can keep it. But to the point of partisanship, that's not going away for as long as the republic endures. And your book is, I think, indispensable in that. Folks, H.W. Brands has joined me today. Founding Partisans, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the brawling birth of American politics. If you think you're living through things for the first time, or you believe history begins with you, you are wrong. Everything old is new again, and certainly in America. A wise person once said, though it's attributed to Mark Twain, history may not repeat, but it does rhyme. Thank you, Bill, for joining the program here at Dirty Moderate. And we're going to have you back when your next book comes out.
Very good. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks so much. In the meantime, stay dirty, stay moderate, stay safe.